All righty. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining today. Looking very forward to this webinar and sharing lots of awesome content with you all. We're going to wait here just a couple more minutes before kicking things off here, just to allow a few more attendees the time to join, knowing that we're all running from one meeting to the next. But feel free to jump in the chat and share where you're joining in from, what city, because we like these webinars to be very interactive. And I will be monitoring the chat throughout. So as questions come up, ideas, if you have a suggestion, feel free to jump in. This webinar is customers only. And so we are going to have some fun on here sharing a bunch of best practices. Awesome. Welcome, Jonathan. So we'll get started here in just a couple more seconds. Alrighty. So thank you all for joining today. I am very excited for today's session. Again, this one is just for customers. So all of you have either been using Spekit for a long time, potentially up to 5 years, or you might have just recently purchased and might be mid implementation and looking to hear about best practices on how to make Spekit a success within your org. And I like to tell people that Spekit is often just a big step that companies take in really bringing up their level of operational excellence when it comes to documentation as a whole. And so a lot of what I'm going to share today is not just about making Spekit a habit, but also how do you develop a habit of really clean and consistent documentation for your orgs. So I've got just a couple quick admin things here. So for anyone who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, I'm Melanie, co-founder and CEO here. Spekit was inspired by my experience, really responsible for both implementing and driving adoption of Salesforce, as well as our other internal tools, and also just challenges that we were facing around broader enablement and knowledge sharing. And so after spending about a year looking at every solution you can think of under the sun across LMSs and CMSs and digital adoption platforms, eventually created Spekit. So it's been a really fun vision to bring to life and product, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I love getting to interact with our customers, so please feel free to jump in with any questions along the way. Quick couple announcements. If any of you are attending these events, we're going to be at ATD, which is a big learning and development conference next week in San Diego. If you're going to be there, I would love to connect in person, potentially do dinner. And then we are attending the next few Dreamin' events. These are Salesforce community events happening in Texas, Buckeye, and Tahoe. So make sure to look for our team. If you're there, please come and say hi. Awesome. And then just a couple quick announcements. If you haven't seen it yet, we did launch our new login experience, really based on all of your feedback around the original login experience being a little bit confusing depending on different login options. And so we've simplified it so that all the user needs to do is put their email in. And if you have SSO, it'll automatically log them in. And then we just launched a new update to the Chrome extension login as well to make sure that employees understand what Spekit is before they log in. So take a look if you haven't yet here. We also just launched some new accessibility updates. For those of you that aren't aware, accessibility has been a really big focus of ours over the last year plus. We just launched focus states on all of our new buttons, and we're continuing to make investments here. We're going to be launching new improved navigation and the extension to make it more accessible around our notifications and Ask an Expert. And then we're going to be doing a lot of work around our embedded icons and the extension homepage, really with the goal of being as inclusive as possible in terms of the value that Spekit can bring to your organization. So keep an ear out for more updates on that front as well. Now, if this is the first time that you're joining one of our customer webinars, I do want to make sure that you're aware of our Spekit resources page. It has a list of all the recent webinars we've done. We've had some really great ones recently on change management and content strategy. We've been really trying to focus on topics that we know that many of you are either really bringing into your organization for the first time or looking to mature in your organization. And so there's some really great content there. And we've started launching best practice guides that accompany these. So we'll be sharing one after this webinar too, over the next week or so, but make sure to check out our resources to find those guides and ebooks as well as webinars. We have recordings there in case you've missed any in the past. And then as you go through and talk to your CSM, if there are any ideas around the kinds of content you would like to learn more about, the kinds of best practices, feel free to reach out to me or your CSM, and we'd love to continue to really bring educational value to you all. Awesome. So today, what we're going to talk about a little bit is one, just a few guiding principles around making Spekit a habit within your organization. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're just joining, it's not only about making Spekit a habit, but really making documentation and process excellence a habit in your organization. So we'll be talking a little bit at a high level. We'll talk about what that looks like to set up Spekit for success. And then really the bulk of the webinar is going to be spent on best practices. And so we're actually going to spend a lot of time going in between slides and demo examples. So bear with me as I kind of navigate, but I wanted to not just present at y'all, but actually show you some real life examples of our own org. So I'll be giving a few sneak peeks at specific examples that we use and really just make it as interactive as possible. And so if you have questions, if you have ideas, please feel free to jump in the chat as we go through. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll walk away with a few tactical pieces that you can implement starting tomorrow in your own org, and hopefully learn a few things about some of our hidden features you might not have been aware of. Awesome. So just taking a step back, when we think about this problem of documentation and learning and knowledge, ultimately, we really set out to solve this problem that I fundamentally believe that the way we learn and enable and train at work has been broken. We still use a lot of the practices from years ago, which is why so many companies struggle to really get the productivity and efficiency they want from their employees. And it's not for lack of trying. Many teams like yourselves have documentation, but it's scattered, maybe it's outdated, it's hard to find an answer. And so we really envisioned a world where learning was in the flow of work, where knowledge finds you, answers find you as an employee, it's instantly accessible, where content is contextual and trusted and personalized, and ultimately where mastering your skills at work is as fun as it is in our personal lives. And so this is really the future we're building here. We've tackled some of these really well. Others we're investing a lot this year. And so we appreciate you all being on this journey with us as we look to bring this vision to the market. And today we solve for a number of these different use cases. And I'm just going to set a little bit of expectations here. What I love the most about our customer base is there is so much variety across industries and size companies and use cases. And so today I really prepared content that is meant to address all of our customers, right? So many of you are either on the Salesforce team or L&D team, enablement team. And so some examples might be more relevant to some teams than others, but my goal is to, if anything, give you ideas and inspiration for the different ways that you can use Spekit within your teams as well. And so when we think about really what are some of the guiding principles around making just-in-time learning, making Spekit a habit, we really think of three different prongs in this flywheel. One, how do we make creating content something that's a really easy experience, something that happens naturally at different points when new processes update, when changes are made to your organization, and then how do we make it easy to curate that content? We talk a lot about governance, and this is an area that we're going to be investing a ton in over the next 6 months, but how do we make sure that once you create that content, it's easy to maintain, it's easy to stay up to date, and ultimately it stays relevant and trusted for your employees? And then finally, how do we make it easy to consume? How do we make sure that as an employee, wherever I am, the answer is easy to find? And that's where the design elements of Spekit come into play as well. So let's talk a little bit about documentation. At the end of the day, where most of you all spend your time documenting Spekit is around kind of tool training and process documentation. Many of you also build out enablement. What I find particularly challenging, not just unique to Spekit, but companies in general, is this area of process documentation, right? If you're in a regulated industry, and I came from real estate investments, there are certain processes that we have to have documented from a compliance standpoint. But the reality is that a lot of other process documentation often lacks clear ownership, often doesn't get celebrated enough, right? People get promoted when they build a new onboarding program, but not necessarily when process documentation is really well, going really well. And what's interesting is that when you have really good documentation because questions disappear, people seem happier, but it is a pain when you don't. And so I think that this is just an area that if you feel like you're struggling to make this a habit and to really get buy-in from the org, you're not alone. And so first, we're going to talk a little bit about how to get the rest of your team bought in to really up-leveling your approach to documentation as a whole before I go into very specific product examples. So the first piece, and if you join past webinars, we talk a lot about this, but it's important to make sure that you have the right buy-in, right? You have the right people involved, ideally from day one, helping you identify what are going to be the most important and valuable use cases. What are the biggest pain points that your field reps or CSMs or employees are facing right now? And that guidance can come from different areas, right? Maybe it's your L&D team and working with them on figuring out like how and when does Spekit get introduced to an employee during onboarding. Maybe it's your end users, power users that can help you identify like what are the key points that are constantly causing frustration and confusion in the process. Maybe it's your frontline managers who are ultimately going to be responsible for driving adoption of Spekit, for reinforcing the use of Spekit with your employees. And so just making sure that you're really taking the time to ask yourself, like, do I have the right people both bought in to this vision that I have for better documentation here, for a better learning experience, for more Salesforce adoption? And how do I make sure that I get them pulled in at the right moments? The second piece, and I want to share a few stats here. So we've done quite a bit of analysis to understand what separates our best customers, the ones that have by far the highest weekly active usage, the ones that are constantly expanding their use cases to different teams. And what we found is that on average, our most active customers create almost twice as much content as our less active customers. And so at the end of the day, content is going to be really, really critical to Spekit's success within your team. And we find that not only having content, but making sure that you're adding content regularly. So what we found is that our top customers are adding new content much more regularly to Spekit because they're really integrated in, they've really integrated Spekit into their Salesforce release management process. They've integrated Spekit into different ways that they onboard new hires. And so something to ask yourself too, if you feel like you're not adding content at least once a week or every 2 weeks, how can you identify what content is necessary, right? Maybe that's working with your help desk support team and identifying like what questions have come in recently that people didn't have answers to. Maybe that's talking to new hires and doing a survey to identify what questions were confusing to them when they were learning Salesforce recently. But the one thing that's true is that as an admin, as a content creator, the more you can make Spekit part of your habit and the more content and updates you're pushing, the more usage you're going to get from your end users as well. And a reminder of making it really part of how they learn and operate. And so if you don't have one already, what we really recommend is that you make sure that you spend time building a strategy around Spekit, right? What we find is that most companies, when they buy Spekit, they have a very specific use case in mind, right? Maybe you're about to go live with Salesforce, or maybe you're making a huge change to your sales process. And so you're really narrowly focused on making sure that your employees are supported with that content. And that's a great place to start. However, making sure that once you go live, it doesn't become just like any other documentation and then ends up going out of date and sitting idle. So what we recommend is that you really spend time by involving the right peoples from your team, identifying what are other use cases for Spekit, right? What are different ways and what are different kinds of content that you can build in Spekit? Maybe talk to your enablement team about what's happening at your annual kickoff. What are the big announcements? What are the big changes? How can you build some of that reinforcement in Spekit? Maybe that's new pricing or packaging that tends to hold the field back. And so really thinking about both your tools and training, right? So Salesforce, your key processes, and then enablement, because ultimately what you want to make sure is that it's not just tool training because your end users aren't going to get as excited about that, right? What are some of that field enablement that you can put in Spekit too that will get them really excited? So making sure that you have a roadmap by partnering with your Salesforce team, partnering with your enablement team, and figuring out, how can Spekit really be valuable in reinforcing that content. And in terms of getting feedback, right, we recommend a few things. Many of you will have all done this during onboarding, but making sure that, during the planning phase, you're doing surveys, you're identifying like, what are the pain points today that if we could just put that enablement, put that content in the user's workflows, we could get some big wins. User testing, making sure that you get end users involved and actually giving you feedback on the content. Doing a manager roadshow. We had a customer here that rolled out to 2,000 users completely async. But the reason why it was so successful is because they did a training for all the managers beforehand. And so all the managers were excited. They were asking to be experts. They were really, really excited to be able to reinforce that with their teams. And then there's a number of things that you can do post-launches as well to make sure that you're getting that constant feedback, that regular feedback. So now let's start getting into a few different examples that I think are really important, right? So when it comes to making Spekit a habit, we're going to talk about a number of different tips and tricks that will save you time as an admin. But I think before we talk about those specific examples, it's important to recognize And I was actually just on a call a couple of days ago where a customer said, we've rolled out Spekit, but we still haven't actually talked to our L&D team to figure out how Spekit is going to get introduced to new hires. And that to me was immediately a warning flag, because ultimately new hires are going to get the most value because everything's a change to them, right? They may or may not have come from your industry. They may or may not have ever used the systems that you have in place. And so making sure that you're partnering with your L&D team or your enablement team to figure out, how can you make sure that you have content in Spekit that specifically speaks to new hires? And what we recommend here, and I'm actually going to show you all a couple examples of ours, is actually creating a sales onboarding team. And the idea here is that as a new hire, you can have your new sales user, and this could be really for any type of user you have, but you can have them added to a specific sales onboarding team, for example. So this is ours here, which is going to load. And so you can see here that whenever we have a new hire join, we have them specifically in our sales onboarding team. And the reason for doing that is that we have a lot of in-depth content on each of our sales stages. Really, our entire sales process is what our sales team needs to master the most when it comes to their processes. And so we have a ton of details here that they can go through as a new hire during onboarding. Oops, I've got a filter on here. Let me go back. So I'm just going to go to our sales onboarding team. You'll see we have a ton of teams. And so they can go through that content one by one and review that at their own pace before seeing that reinforcement. Then you can make sure that you actually reinforce with knowledge checks. And I'm going to give an example of what that looks like, but our knowledge checks are bite-sized assessments that you can use at the end of each week. And so moving to a very specific example here, what our onboarding team has done is they've created an onboarding checklist. So what we found is that when a new hire joins, there are so many different tools they need to set up. There's so many actions they need to take, like updating their LinkedIn and their bio and all these different details that we want them to do. And so our head of people has created this onboarding checklist. And so I'm actually going to show you what that looks like here. So we have a little bit of a high level, and this is one of the only examples I'll show that is not exactly a best practice, only because it's a bit longer than what we recommend. But the reason is that way, wherever they are in their browser, they can quickly both favorite this so that they can access this checklist at any time, but they can really easily make their way down this list of things that they need to go through, right? We have videos they need to watch. We have actions they need to take in terms of their LinkedIn. And again, if you have a really advanced HRIS system or an advanced LMS, they can do that there too. But the benefit of having a simple tools checklist here is that they can actually do that and have the checklist follow them around in every single tool that they're in. And then at the end, we created a little knowledge check here, which is super simple and is going to take them to this knowledge check. Let me just pull it up here. Oops. Oh shoot, because I'm an admin, I can't see it. Let me go ahead in our learning. See, this is the problem when we demo a bit live here, but I will show here the knowledge check that we have for new hires takes them through what is Spekit, right? Our mascot. You can have them go through a few questions around like, what is it that we envision in the world? How is our product unique? And so it's a very simple bite-sized assessment. And then we actually link them to a resource at the end that takes them to get a Spekit. So this is just a simple, fun little illustration of how we use knowledge checks throughout our onboarding for new hires to go through throughout the process. And if you have knowledge checks, you can really easily create them by simply clicking create here and creating a knowledge check right here. Awesome. So moving towards, from an onboarding standpoint, what we also recommend is just making sure that you order your specs. Now, if you've been a customer for a long time, ordering specs is an area that we are very much looking to invest in to make it easier for you to order specs in the exact order that you want within a topic. But what we recommend is making sure that when it comes to new hires, right, you create a simple order in your topics and you can enumerate them today to help them introduce and follow the flow. So for example, first, what is Salesforce, right? Why do we use Salesforce at Acme Co? How do you log in? Here's a quick navigation, right? And so you can have these little micro topics that guide a new user through the system for the first time in a very ordered manner. Another example is our SDR prospecting playbook. So for our BDRs, when we have them go do prospecting, we have them go through what we call playbooks. And so, for example, here's an example of one where we have them start by doing company research, then search for your prospects, then create a lead, then add the prospect to outreach, right? And so this workflow happens across multiple different systems, but we have a single topic that allows them to go through that content step by step to make it really easy for them to understand what does that actual workflow end to end look like that they need to follow. So ordering specs is a way to make sure that you're creating essentially little journeys for your employees to go through rather than just having a bunch of little specs left and right. Awesome. Now, this example I'm using here is really about starting to incorporate Spekit as part of your operating cadence. So if your sales enablement team has a weekly sales training, or maybe it's biweekly, or if your Salesforce team has a biweekly Salesforce training where you actually do a live training with your users, what we recommend, and I actually am sending this to the team later because we're doing one on competition tomorrow, is that you send a spec to them to read before the training. So this is a spec and a battle card specifically on, how can they position against other types of solutions in our space, and why are those solutions potentially not as effective as we are at solving for specific problems. And so what we do is we send them an email saying, hey, please read this training before the webinar tomorrow. Then we actually will showcase and use our web app experience to actually go through that content with them live. And the benefit here is instead of creating duplicate content, so creating slide decks in one place and then having specs, we'll actually repurpose this content to present live this way so that it's really easy for you to just kill multiple birds with one stone by having the pre-read, the actual live training, and then the follow-up all in one spec. And what we recommend is that if there's links that you want to send people to here, you actually post that in the chat so that they know where the reinforcement is. This can work really well too if you do Salesforce walkthroughs with new hires still. And you're walking them through the org as a whole, you can actually walk them through that Salesforce training topic that you created and then point them to where they can find those resources afterwards. But starting to incorporate it in the way that you do training will make a really big difference because now they'll start seeing Spekit injected into their processes at different points in time. And then finally, sending a spotlight with a knowledge check afterwards. So this is something that we do quite a bit, especially in an example like this, where we launch new enablement on competitors, and we want to actually test whether people understand it. We're going to send a little spotlight in Salesforce, which is where on the opportunity object where they track competition, so that before they next log competition, they can take that little knowledge check there. And so that way you're doing really quick, rapid enablement on these process changes or new resources that you're launching to them. Awesome. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of challenges with presentation here. A little bit of slowness over Zoom. So with that, now that we've talked a little bit about how to incorporate it into your everyday processes from an onboarding standpoint, from a workflow standpoint, identifying those trainings, I'm going to go through a series of tips here on how you can use some of our features as an admin to save your time. Because I think one of the biggest challenges is that questions come up all the time, but you might not always be in a position where you have time to actually document things right there. So we're going to go through a few examples of how you can set up Spekit to save your time. The first piece, and this has come up quite a few times recently, which is why I'm introducing it here, but going back to some of that data I shared earlier, it's very clear that our most active customers, our top 20 customers relative to everyone else, have almost double the amount of experts. And while for smaller teams, right, if you only have about 100 employees, this ratio changes. The truth is that the more people that you have adding content to Spekit, the more content you're going to have. And one of the things we've uncovered is that there's a little bit of fear there, right? There's fear because you don't want people adding content that you haven't viewed or that you haven't had a chance to review. You want to make sure that the content is really, really strong and up to date. And so what we recommend is making sure that you're leveraging our Teams functionality and our roles. So you can actually create a team called content creators or content creation, where you give specific individuals on your team the ability to create content just for that team. And we'll talk about how to create a drafts topic there too, but that way they can create content on that team, but not for others. Another approach is that you can actually assign experts by team. So for example, in this user, they have the ability to create content for a number of our teams, but they don't have the ability to add content for our success team. And so this is a way that you can bring in more people to create content, but still ensure that you have the governance protocols around that to ensure that you have the quality of content, frankly, that you want to maintain. And we're going to talk about templates and things like that as well that you can do, but just making sure that you're really leveraging our roles and teams functionality. And as a refresher for everyone, teams determine, if you're in a team, the team you're in determines what content you have access to, and you can have users in multiple teams. Your role determines what actions you can take in Spekit, right? So an expert can create content, but they can't invite users. A team admin can assign experts and do a number of other functionality. A viewer is going to be read only. So making sure that you're using that to unblock getting more content inside of Spekit is going to be a really, really big driver of success here. The next is using our to-do list. So how many of you, and just curious, have never heard of this to-do list? And feel free to mention in the chat if this looks completely new to you here, or you maybe don't know how to use it. And Alexis, I just saw your question. The contributor role is the expert role. So that is the role that can add content. Awesome, great to see that this is new to a number of folks. So this is actually functionality we've had since day one, and it's pretty simple. So I'm going to go ahead and give an example here. So let's say that a question came up and you don't have time to document it right now, and you want to add it to your to-do list or to someone else's. What we recommend is that you create a spec here, and it's quite simple. The first thing you're going to do is just add a label, right? So let's say that the question came up is, how does our to-do list work? How does our to-do list work? Now, to make sure it shows up on the to-do list, you're not going to document the label. You're not going to document the definition, because the definition is ultimately what will remove it from the to-do list, because it assumes that you've actually created the content. So the next thing here is I'm going to add it to a to-do specs topic that I created, which is basically a topic that's a catch-all that we put in where it's like, hey, someone needs to go document this. We don't have time to right now. And you can actually assign it to someone on your team, or in this case, for this demo, for it to show up on my to-do list, I'm just going to assign it to myself. And so the requirements for it to show up on your to-do list is you have a label, you don't have any documentation written yet, and this is not a necessary step. This is what I recommend, though, is creating a to-do specs topic so that you can easily go to it with everything, and then just making sure that it's assigned to an expert. Once you create that, and you go, and I'm actually just going to open up a new window here because I want to show something in that last page. Once you go to your to-do list, it's now going to show up here. So it's on your home page, and it's going to show up in your to-do list of any spec that you have added to your to-do list, meaning it's assigned to you. There's a label, but there's no content actually written there. And you can click view all here to view everything that's been assigned to you that you haven't necessarily documented yet. So that's one way. Of course, you can also then go to your to-do specs topic to view all the content that you have in that topic as well. So this is a very simple workflow that you can build to make sure that you're putting those questions somewhere that you want to get back to eventually, but that you might not have the time to document in that very moment. So if there's any questions on this functionality, please feel free to jump in and post it there. And again, it works for any expert. So if you assign it to another expert on your team, it's going to show up in their list as well. Awesome. Now, my recommendation for the to-do list is when you're actually setting up the topic, make sure that you add your content approvers or your content team, and that way it's not necessarily shown up for all your users. If there's no content in the spec itself, it's not going to be searchable. It's not going to show up for your users, but this is a way so that your content team can kind of use that shared to-do list and that shared topic, but other users won't see that to-do topic show up in their list of topics. Very similarly, we recommend creating a drafts topic. So I think of to-do lists and drafts slightly separate. The to-do list is really, hey, I need to document this thing later. I don't have the time to do it right now. A drafts topic is I've created this content and either I want someone else on my team to take a look at it, or I'm just not happy with it yet to be able to push it to our users. And so you can create a drafts topic in your org. And again, we recommend just putting that the only team that has access to it is your content approvers or your content creators team that you create. And if you have questions on how to create a team like that, post it in the chat, I can share it later. And then a pro tip that, again, some of you might not be aware of is that in our what we call dictionary view, it's really just a glossary of all your content. You can create custom attributes on fields. And so while we don't have a proper approval workflow and expiration date features today, that said, that is something that we are very excited about building this year now that we have our foundation of our new rich text editor in place. There are ways that you can still do some of that today. So I'm just going to demo that real quick for some of you. So going back to the page that I had set aside here, what you're seeing here is a list of specs. You can see the expert functionality here. You can see when it was last edited, who modified it. And then you're seeing two attributes here that might not be familiar to you because you might not have them in your org. Now, if I click on this spec, what you're going to see here is that if I click edit at the very bottom here, I now have additional boxes. So these are what we call custom columns in a spreadsheet that you can add, or custom attributes to any spec to track any custom attributes that you want. In this case, I used approval date and expiration date. Maybe you want to track like the API integration to another system, but it's very easy to set up. And it's simply in your settings, you go to admin tools, and then here you'll see create a column. So you just simply enter the column and select what it applies to, whether it's your objects, booklets, and fields, if you have Salesforce, or specs only. And so that's a way today that you can at least track that information. But again, in the future, this is an area that we want to invest in further. Awesome. Now, Joey, I saw your question. Is there a way to run a report to view all the to-do items across our org to see if they should be reassigned or check status? So there isn't a global to-do list, but I'm going to show you how I would go about finding that information. What I would do is I would go to my view all specs here. And if you filter here, you can do that in our spec governance dashboard too, but I would go under undocumented. So you just go under undocumented specs, assuming you've hidden everything else, and then you can view everything that has not been documented recently. You can then also sort it by created date. So seeing all the new ones that have been created to see all the ones recently that have not been documented, and see whether you've assigned an expert to them. If you haven't assigned an expert and these are things that you want to document, you can go through and select everything that you want to assign to an expert and say, you know what, hey, I want to assign an expert to these, and go ahead and do that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this functionality here when we get to our Salesforce release management functionality as well. Hopefully that answers your question. Awesome. So as I mentioned, creating specs on the go, right? If you have time to, is really great. We always recommend first that you search to see if an answer already exists. We're going to be talking a little bit more about our search here in a second. And then as a reminder, you can always create a spec really from any application just by clicking spec here and opening it up, or you can even do it in Slack. And then once you have your to-do and draft topics set up, it's really easy to just park them there until you have the time to revisit. Now, I want to pull up a very specific example that came up for those of you that use our Slack integration. This example actually came up yesterday when I was talking to our support manager. Many of you might be familiar with him, Morgan. So I actually was asking him a question about our SSO and IDP functionality to better understand the differences between our SCIM and just-in-time SSO functionality. So he took the time to explain that to me, right? Just-in-time is a one-way street between our IDP and Spekit. SCIM is a two-way street. So he wrote down this technical information. I searched Spekit. I realized that there wasn't anything on it. And so I simply used our extension to say create. And I went ahead and created a spec right there from that answer that then automatically posted here. The benefit being that now that information didn't just get shared between the two of us, but anyone on our team that searches for this answer in the future can find it. So this is another example of really quick ways that you can capture that information, capture that knowledge that happens in your day-to-day. You can do the same functionality using our Chrome extension in your support center to make sure that you're not losing valuable information as it gets exchanged and not constantly having to repeat yourself. And on that note, I want to share, because we're planning to launch it sometime next week, but we are ready to announce our new rich text editor. And the benefit here is that it's going to make creating content a lot easier. So the first version we're launching is going to have a few pieces of functionality that I'm going to share right now, and then we're going to fast follow very quickly after with tables and colors and more. So just to give you an example, one of the current challenges in our current editing experience is copying and pasting images, links, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say, I created this slide and I was presenting it, but I'm like, you know what, this would really be helpful as a spec that lives on in the future. Or maybe you already have decks of content you've created that you just haven't had the time to transfer over. So what you can do here is I'm just going to go ahead and copy all of this information here, including the images. I'm going to create a spec here. So as pasting, this doesn't look like it's where I want it to be. So I'm going to go down here and paste it below. And you'll see here that you can resize the images if you want, you can align them. And so we give a lot more functionality around how you work with our images here. And my favorite part and this is part of the initial release, is let's say you actually have a video. When you paste the link, whether it's from YouTube or whatever source, it's actually going to embed right there. So you don't need to do any sort of fancy embedding functionality. We're going to grab it. And this is actually a quick demo that our head of product or a product manager recorded of all the functionality that's going to be launching here very soon. So you're going to see different fonts, different colors. You'll see different uses of emojis, different kinds of text alignment, and of course, tables, which we know are one of our highest requested features. So all of this is coming here very, very shortly. Many of you in our beta program have already had a chance to test, but hopefully grabbing information from other places, be it your email, PowerPoints, or other, is going to get a lot faster to create in Spekit for all of you. Awesome. And Mark, great question. V1 is not going to be able to crop images. It is something that we deeply want to add. We have others that are going to be able to other functionality, like being able to actually embed a PDF inside so that you can read through the PDF. So there's a ton of things that we want to do in this rich text editor, being able to at another spec so that it makes it easier to link from one spec to another. So there's going to be a lot more things we're doing on the new rich text editor coming here over the next couple of months. We're actually doing a lot about our current focus right now is on our core experience, making it the best possible way to create content, link content, and ultimately make your lives easier. So if you have requests, please share them with your CSM. Please share them with us, because many of these requests were prioritized. We actually prioritized 46 requests for this new content creation experience based on all the feedback that you all have shared with your CSMs. So on the note of making content faster and easier to create, I want to share another tip that we recommend for admins, and it's really creating templates. So on our team, we actually have a folder called Spekit templates. This can be a really easy way for your admins and content creators to store any type of template that you have. One example is, for example, our revenue newsletter template. So our head of revenue operations sends out an update to all of our go-to-market teams across our customer success and support teams, marketing and sales every 2 weeks. And so she has a template here that's really easy to copy. So at any point in time, you can simply clone this spec and fill it out. You can do that from the web app, of course, as well. But having a few of these templates built out, both for your Salesforce release management, as well as any other regular updates that you send your team, can be a huge time saver for your team. And it can also ensure consistency in how you communicate updates. So if you don't have templates set up, highly recommend. If you want inspiration for some, let us know. But setting up templates can be a huge time saver. So for example, for this one, our RevOps team always communicates any sort of systems updates across our technology stack, any sort of enablement updates, right? Hey, you've got new battle cards or whatever it is. Our marketing team communicates, recent events that they need to follow up on. And then we have support and product updates as well. And the benefit is that then the sales team has a single topic for their revenue updates that they can access at any point in time. So the goal is to make it centralized. And even if they miss that one update you sent, they know they can go to that topic and see all recent revenue updates or all recent Salesforce release templates as well. So if you want some inspiration for what these can look like, let us know. Happy to share these, but that way you can have a single template here that you share, and then you link to any new fields that you've created, new processes that you've documented, et cetera, et cetera. And again, these are really things that you want to set up early to save you a bit of time. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about content users will love. And normally I'd be full screen, but since I keep going back and forth between the demo, I'm going to keep in this view if that's okay. So when it comes to creating content your users will love, one very, very simple thing I notice when we do QBRs with our customers is that they haven't really taken the time to make Spekit look delightful. And while it seems like such a simple task to do, which is just making sure that you've got the relevant logos or you've got nice icons set up, oftentimes we just see the standard bookmark, which is fine, but it just doesn't really bring the content to life in a way that it can. And frankly, that's part of what we spend a lot of time thinking about is how can we make documentation a more delightful experience for end users? Because half the problem that many of our customers, including yourselves, have come to us is that our reps don't want to go to Confluence. They can't find information. It's not visually appealing. And so we did just add a ton of new options. If you haven't checked it out yet, under our topics. So if you go to create a topic, what you'll see here is that we've added a ton of new options just to save you your time in bringing your Spekit content to life a bit. So check it out. Hopefully this saves you a bit of time, but we really recommend that you take the time to both kind of set up structure, right? Going back to the onboarding use case and how you set up your content, and that you add icons where you can. And on that note, when it comes to icons, in the future, we want to allow for branding potentially. But in the meantime, if you want to make Spekit feel a little bit more like your organization, there's a ton of websites that allow you to just put in your company's color codes and to change all the icons so that you can create your own little library of branded icons that you can use for Spekit too. We've seen some really cool things from our customers doing that as well. Now, on the topic of using consistent naming conventions, and I spoke a lot about this at the content strategy session, so I won't spend too much time on it today. Definitely check that out. But we do have new search experience coming. So in this quarter, so this is our Q2 that just kicked off. One of our squads, our data team, is 100% focused on search. It is very clear that today we don't accommodate for misspellings and synonyms and things that ultimately take away from being able to quickly find an answer. And so far in the version that we are testing internally, we've addressed 8 of the 9 biggest requests from customers to address, which is super exciting. And we're ultimately moving towards a search experience where you don't need to filter. Like currently you need to filter by specs and topics to find the answer. But in the future, the goal is that you actually have a single experience where you can search for anything and find all results that come up. So search is going to be a huge area that we're investing in, making it more personalized over time. So something else to be excited about what's coming here soon. Now, when it comes to creating content in Spekit, going back to making content that's delightful, I think another one of the hardest transitions from traditional documentation to Spekit is moving from really long form Google Docs or PDFs and PowerPoints to building bite-sized content. And you're not alone if you're struggling to transition. So just a couple really quick tips. I recommend following the 2-scroll rule. And so what I mean by that is if I pull up one of our recent specs, I recommend that as a user, the max amount of time that someone needs to spend scrolling is 2 scrolls. So this is actually our stage 1 spec. So in Salesforce, we've documented each of our stages. This is our stage 1. And what you'll see is that to minimize scrolls, right, there's a ton of things that we want our sales team doing while they're in this stage. But instead of what we've done is we've actually linked out at the top here to point them to the resources that they care most about, to both a topic and discovery questions that they can ask to qualify their prospects. And we recommend putting any links you have to other specs at the top so that it's really easy for them to get to it right here. So again, if you noticed there earlier, we had emojis to indicate what kind of content it is. And if you feel like you want to train them, so our head of sales actually did a whole training on BANT. If you feel like there's something that's going to take too long to write, we really recommend embedding a quick video, because it's just that much more effective than writing content that's going to take you a ton of time to write, or for the end user to have to read and read. Ultimately, they just won't do it. So making sure that you're keeping your specs to the 2-scroll rule. It's also best practice that we give for emailing, right? You want someone on their phone to be able to read the email in 2 scrolls. That can be an easy kind of test on whether or not your spec is meeting best practices. Now, on the topic of specs, I figured since you all are constantly trying new use cases, that I'd share a couple of our favorite specs. Now, I don't anticipate you all to store necessarily this kind of information in Spekit, depending on really, what team is currently owning it at your company, or what use cases you think are best used for it, or what other systems you might have. But we use it pretty much for everything, because we like really testing out all the different possibilities. And one of my favorite specs, if you've ever worked at a company that has a bunch of different colors and you want to make sure that you're following the color guidelines when you're creating content, but you can never find what the color codes are, our marketing team created a very simple spec here that you can access and grab the hex code, so that when you're trying to update colors in a deck, which I spend a lot of my time in decks, you can quickly grab the hex codes and paste them in. Again, it's just a quick reference sheet, but this is one of our highest utilized specs across the company, especially for your sales reps and your success teams, the ones that are constantly creating content. They're often creating their own slides. This can be a very simple spec that you put in there that will get a ton of usage. Another one that we have is actually just a quick link to our master deck. So this is our slides template, the same template that I used to create this deck. And it's meant to just be really easy to reference. And so what we do actually is we actually link to Google Slides. Here we have a whole topic that has just a few of the most used resources that anyone can access directly from Google Slides. So again, when you open Spekit on Google Slides, we have a number of topics that are linked. Oops, let me just share. That are linked right here that show you resources available to you while you're in PowerPoint mode. So again, these are my favorite ones. I'm not your typical user. That said, we do find that our team across every single department uses these slides a lot. And the last one is our product roadmap slide. This is, I don't know if you all face this challenge, but making sure that our sales teams and CS teams and support teams understand what's coming up and what's being built and what they can communicate to all of you that are asking questions. We've tried a ton of different methods. We've had PowerPoint decks, we do biweekly email releases and everything else in between. And still questions are constantly coming up. Is this on the roadmap? Is this coming up as they come out of conversations with you all? And so we recently moved, and this is now our highest viewed spec in our entire org across the entire company, to having a single spec here that has all the key initiatives that we have on the roadmap with a link to the deck that everyone can access, again, from any workflow. So this just makes it easier than having to track down an email where the last update was communicated and point our users to exactly what they have. And these are the kinds of specs that we see all of our own internal users actually favoriting for easy access. A couple other inspiration to make your end users excited. If you're, and this might be your account executive team as well, if your BDR team is using Spekit, we found that this spec was actually created by one of our BDRs who requested it. And if any of you are familiar with LinkedIn Sales Navigator, which is a tool that you can use to find prospects, it can be a real pain to try and figure out, how do you search and how do you save your leads? And so what we have is we have a very simple spec here that actually has saved Boolean search phrases that our BDRs simply take this copy instead of having to write it every time, and can then paste it into their current titles. And so this spec is our highest used spec for our BDR team. We have it for every single kind of role that we manage. But again, these are some of the quick time savers that you can favorite as a BDR and get a lot of excitement from your frontline teams, because this is the kind of content that they actually need to access in their day-to-day. And finally, for our account executives, the content that they check the most is our competitive battle cards. We've documented every single one of our competitors or different categories of software in our space inside of Salesforce. And we have a really quick battle card that they can review with, hey, how do we compare to these kinds of solutions? Where do we win? How do we compete? And then we link out to additional resources as well. And the reason I highlight these examples is that ultimately, if you're strictly putting how to use Salesforce and how to navigate processes, you're likely not going to get as many ideas and demand and excitement from the field than if you put a few different examples of use cases of specs that really get your field teams excited about using it, that really helps them in their day-to-day jobs, where they start really understanding like, oh, wow, like this is such an easier way for me to access the information I need. So hopefully this gives you a few different ideas that you can implement as well within your teams. Awesome. So now we'll talk a little bit about Salesforce release management in Spekit. So for those of you that aren't quite as familiar with our extension, it was really uniquely designed by my pain as an admin, where I had one team that was making changes to Salesforce and another team responsible for training on the changes. And somehow those two teams were never really communicating, even though they both technically reported up to me. And it was just constantly a pain point to keep track of what are all the new things in Salesforce. The training team was getting pulled in at the 11th hour. And so really, I wanted to build a more scalable type of process documentation, which is why we're truly the only solution on the market that has this kind of integration, where the whole premise was, what if as we make changes to Salesforce, we could pull those fields in, we could track those changes, decide what we want to document, and do that all in one workflow. And so that's how our sync works today, right? You can sync, you can select the objects. We always recommend only pulling in the objects that you actually plan to document. You can always go back to the object import page. You can then document, and then of course our extension automatically embeds that. Now, a couple quick tips for those of you that use the integration but might not really know how do you incorporate it into your day-to-day. A few things. As I mentioned, only import the objects you need. And then as you go in and use this, and I'm actually just going to go back to Spekit to demonstrate this. Give me one quick second as I pull this up. So here you can see a ton of different fields that have been pulled in. In this case, I just want to see everything that's been imported into Spekit from Salesforce since May 1st, let's say. So I just want to see what are the new fields in Spekit that have been imported since May 1st, meaning that they were recently created in Salesforce. So under import date, I'm just going to click May 1st. I'm going to click undocumented, meaning that they have not been documented yet. And in this case, I'm just going to click custom fields because that's really all I care about right now. Once I enter this selection, I can see all the fields that were imported. Over here, I'm going to pull up and view recently what the created date was so that I can see when it was actually created. In Spekit, we have a ton of different attributes here. And then what you can do here, and this is what we recommend, is that once you've synced to Salesforce and you've pulled in all the fields, there's a ton of these that you're not going to plan on documenting, right? For example, someone from our marketing team downloaded this graphic pack example. This is not something that we're going to document. And so the first thing we recommend is, frankly, just going through and hiding all these fields. Because otherwise, as an admin, it's constantly going to crowd your view, and it's also going to crowd your search, because as an admin, you can search for everything, including what's not documented. So if you sync to Salesforce, you go in, you select the date in your filters around like when you want to look at new fields that were imported since. The first thing you do is you go through and you go and hide the fields that you don't need to document. You can, of course, select all or go one by one. It takes about 10 minutes, usually, depending on how many fields you have, to go do this. Once you hide them, they will no longer show up in your views or search results at any point in time. So if I refresh this page, they won't show up here at any point in time. You can always view those hidden specs if you decide in the future that you want to potentially document something, but that way it's not crowding your view. And then the next thing you do is you go through and you assign, right? So if you've decided that you or someone on your team needs to document them, once you've synced to Salesforce, you go through, you hide everything, and then you assign them to the expert on your team that is responsible for documentation. And if you do this workflow every single time, and then you create your release update from the template, I guarantee you that it'll become second nature when it comes to your Salesforce change management. So again, I'm going over this pretty quickly because there's a few other things I wanted to cover, which we won't have time today, but definitely recommend doing that. And we already talked about how you can create a Salesforce updates topic with the release notes. You can also create a default spotlight that you clone as well for your Salesforce releases. So under your spotlights, if you want to send a spotlight every 2 weeks with your release notes, you can always clone those as well to save you time in that process. Now, some of you love the idea of using Salesforce Spekit for Salesforce release management or for other updates, but your concern is that, well, not all of our users have actually downloaded Spekit and installed the Chrome extension. And so we're worried that if we send them in, if we just communicate it via Spekit, they're not going to see it. So one simple recommendation I have here is, as you all are getting started on this journey of using Spekit for change management, one simple way that you can do that is when you're sending an email to your team, right, your biweekly update, right, you can say, hey, we've made some big changes. Here's some of what it includes. And then you can point them to the spec that they can open up right here, right, that they'll be able to reference. If you're not fully ready, you can also share the public link if you have that enabled, so that you can actually link them to another link that they can open up, so that they're not completely missing out if they don't have Spekit installed. But the idea here is that you're constantly reinforcing Spekit in these moments where Spekit is the best utilized. So here you're going to see PS, make sure to download the Spekit Chrome extension if you haven't already. This is how we're going to communicate all updates moving forward. So the first few weeks after, or the first few months after launching Spekit, as you're trying to drive adoption, as you're trying to reinforce the use internally, really referencing Spekit in these emails, pointing them to how they can use it is a great way of reinforcing that adoption. Awesome. And on that note, we are also making a lot of investments in our notifications experience. That includes everything from our current notification experience, as well as some new enhancements we'll be making, along with some Slack improvements as well. And so we're really focusing on both making sure that it's easy to create content, search for content, communicate content, and really doubling down on everything we've learned from you all over the last few years around what you'd like to see get done in Spekit. So please continue providing that feedback. From a timing standpoint, the last piece I'm going to show here, since we're up for time, but I just highly recommend that whenever someone sends you a question, if a spec exists, make sure that you share the link to the spec. That is going to be your fastest way to reinforce adoption, to get them going back. You have the ability to copy the content into an email as well of a spec by using our copy button, but making sure that you're reinforcing the use of that share link is going to save you a ton of time. And just as a reminder, this little pro tip I have here, if you don't recall, there is a hotkey with Spekit. So either using our right click or just highlighting and typing the letter S for Spekit, you can quickly search for an answer when a question comes. You can view that information, and then again, you can share it. And so if you don't remember this, very quickly, right click, highlight S, and you'll be able to find that information. So we didn't get through everything I had planned, but hopefully this gave you a little bit of preview of a number of different ways that you can use Spekit in your day-to-day. If you have any additional questions or ideas, feel free to reach out. But hopefully this gave you some new use cases that you can implement with your team. And Glenda, I see that you have a question. If you want to go ahead and type it, I don't know if we have the ability to allow you to talk. So I'll wait for you to post the question in the chat. Awesome. And if anyone else has questions, please feel free to post them here as well. Awesome. Great. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. Hopefully this gave you some good ideas. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, I'm going to post my email in the chat as well. It's melanie@spekit.co. I love hearing from all of you. I review every single feature request, every idea, every sometimes support ticket that comes in. And we are really, really focused on the user experience, both for your end users and yourself. So hopefully this is helpful. And please feel free to share more questions as they come up. And in the meantime, I will answer Chelsea's question. So Chelsea, how do you recommend archiving specs that are no longer needed? For example, our nonprofit has sunset a program and the specs related to that program are no longer needed, but we would like to keep the knowledge for archival purposes. So we don't have advanced archiving functionality today. That is also something that's been requested. That said, what I would recommend is that you create a topic, the topic that you use, you change the label to archived, you put it so that only account admins can see it, so that all of your Spekit users won't see it. And then you can just hide the content. So you can bulk hide all the specs so that they're still existing in the background. You can show hidden specs at any point in time, but they're not going to show up in your searches if you're searching as an admin either. Awesome. And then I just saw, can notifications be triggered off of these attributes? I imagine that you're referring back to the approval and expiration date examples. Unfortunately, the answer is no today. That said, those workflows is something that now that we've rebuilt kind of that content creation experience is something that we're looking to invest in as well. Awesome. All righty. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.